Hello everyone, my name is Nikhil. So in this video, you will see the three best approaches to handle the forms inside the React.js. The first approach would be with the useState hook, and then we will just create a dynamic function with the useState hook to update the forms and to handle the forms. And the second approach would be with useRef hook inside the React.js, and the third approach would be using the useReducer hook. So now all three approaches would be used here to handle the forms. So let's start. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I would be motivated to post the videos like this. So let's start with the first approach. And now I've opened a folder in the VS Code, and now we need to create a new React.js application. So for that, we need to move on to the terminal and we need to select a new terminal from there. And the command to create the React application would be the npx. It would be the create-react-app, and then the name of the application, like in this case it can be the my app. So then you will need to hit enter, and then the new React.js application will be then installed within very few moments. So you just have to wait till it completes the installation in the my app directory. So the React app is now installed, and now we can just move on to the my app directory, and then we can just move on to the source directory. And now you can see now we have the app.js file, which is the main component of all of the React applications. So now we are into the app.js, and now we don't need the header, and then we don't need the content inside that. So I will remove that all. And now I don't need the app.css and the logo as well from there. And now we can just move on to the index.js, and now we are into the index.js, and now you can see now we are just creating a root component for the React application, and then it is having the document.get element by the root, which is linked to the index.html file inside the React.js. So now we can just move on to the public folder, and then we have the index.js, and then you will see there will be a div id equals to the root, which is linked to the index.js, and then it will render the app component there inside that. So now we will use the app component there, and now we don't need the report path vitals. So I will remove this, and I will remove this from here as well. So if we now save, and now we can just move on to the app.js, and now we can just render the hello. So we have the hello and world, and now I need to remove the class name app also from there. So if we now save, if we now just start the application, so for starting the application, we can just move on to the my app directory that the React.js is currently installed, and now we can just run the application by running the npm start command. So it will create a local development server on our machine, and then we will just create and compile the React application onto that server. So we have to hit enter, and then it will be compiled and it will be opened onto the port of the 3000 in our machine. And here you can see now we have the localhost 3000, and now you can see we have the hello world inside our application. So everything is working perfectly fine. And now we will see the first approach to handle the forms inside the React.js, and that first approach would be, so the first approach of handling the form would be the useState. So what is a useState hook? It defines a state variable and a function to update that state variable. But what does that mean? So it is a predefined hook inside the React.js which allows you to have and declare a state variable inside the functional component, and it returns exactly two values. The first value is the state variable that we need to define, and then the second value is the function which uses to update the variable which we have defined inside the state. Like it can be a state and the set state if you are coming from the class based components. So now we pass the initial state to the function, and then it returns a variable with the current state value, and then the another function that it creates, so it will just update the state value inside that. So this is the useState inside the React. So now we will move on to the React application to test and demo the useState. So here I will create a new component inside that, and it would be the form.js, and I will now just create a new functional component here as well. So it will be the const form, it would be equals to a function, and then now we need to export this form as well. So export default, it will be the form. So now we have just created the form component inside that, and now we need to return something inside the form component as well. So we have a return statement, and then we need to return something like it can be a form inside that. So now we need to just move on to the app.js, and now we need to call this form inside the app.js as well. So for that I need to import the React as well from the React. So for the import React from the React. So now we can just move on to the app.js, and then instead of this hello world we can use the form. So we can have the form that we have just created. So now you can see the form is now imported from /form, which is the current directory /the form. So if we now save, so now you will see now we have the form over here which is being rendered inside the form component, and now we need to just create here the form. So for that now we can just remove this, and now we can just define a div which will contain a form, and inside that div we will have a form, and then we can remove the action tag from there because we don't need that. And now we will have here the input, so we can have here the input, and then the type will be equals to the text, and then we can just define the name of the input, which is the identifier of the input, like it can be the name, like it can be my name as well. And after that we can just define a one more input over that, so we can have a one more input, and then it could be the email, so name equals to the email, and the type would also be the email. And after that I will just create a one more input over here, and it will be the password, so the type would be the password, and the name identifier would also be the password. So if we now save, so now you will see there will be the three inputs, and now you can see the stylings are not good, so we will just give a basic stylings to this form as well. So we can just give it the style variable, and then we can have the display, it would be the flex, and then we also give the variable as the flex direction, and then we can give the property as the flex direction, and it will be the column. And then we can just define here the margin, it would be the auto from all of the sides, so that it would be in center. And then we can just define some width, and it will be the hard coded value, so it can be the 400 pixels. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, now you can see now we have the form. So first we have the name variable, so we can give the name as the label as well, so we can have a label, and then HTML4 equals to the name, so it would be the name. We can have here the name, and then we can just copy the label for the email as well, so it would be the name equals to the email, and here as well email. And after that we can just copy this, and then we can just paste this for the password as well, so we have the password, and here as well we will have the password. If we now save, so now you will see now we have the name, we have the email, and the password for the form. And then we can just also have here the margin from the top as well, so with the margin from the top, so it can be the 20 pixels over the top. So if we now save, so now you can see now we have the name, we have the email, and then we have the password inside that. So now everything is working perfectly fine. And then we need to just create a button as well to submit the form, so it can be the button, and then we will just define the type of the button to the submit. So now we have a submit button, and then we can just submit the form from here, so we have the submit from there. So now everything is working perfectly fine. And then now you can see we can just define here the BR tag to have some space between them, so everything is working perfectly fine. And now you can see now we can enter any value inside this form, inside this inputs, but we cannot get any value. So what we can do, so we can just create here a state variable with the useState, and then we can just align the state for every input with that, and then we can just grab their values. So this is the first approach, and this is very easy approach. So inside this first approach only we have two sub approaches as well. So for that now we will see the first approach. So we will declare a useState variable, so we will have here the useState, and then I will create a snippet. So now this is how can we create the state variable inside the React. So we just declare a const, and then we declare a useState, and it returns exactly two values, the first and the second. So now we can just define the variable, and it can be the name, and then it can be the set name. So this is the state variable, and this is the function which will update the value of that name. And after that you have the useState, and then by default the value will be empty, which is empty string. And then we can import the useState as well from the React. So now this state variable will handle the state of the name input, and then we can just create another, and then it would be the name equals to the email, and then it will be the set email, and the email value initially would also be the empty string, so we will just have that. And after that we will just create another state variable for the password, so it can be the password, and then we can just have here this set password. So now all of these fields have the by default empty string value inside that, but how can we update their values? So now first what we need to do is we are declaring a name variable, email, and the password for the inputs. So we should give the values to the inputs as well. So in the input we have a value prop, and the value would be the name that we have defined, and then we have the value for the email as well, name, so it can be the value equals to the email, and for the password the value would be equals to the password. So now we have just defined their values, and now we need to handle their values as well. So if we now save, if I will now go to the application, now you can see if you will enter anything inside that, then it won't accept any value, because we have defined the value as the empty string, because the name is the empty string, and then we are not updating the name or the email and the password as well. So now we need to update their values on every enter. So for that now we can just move on to the input, and then we also have a prop inside the input which is on change. The on change function is called whenever anything is entered into the input. So what we can do that, so now I am declaring a callback variable here, and after that the event will contain so many things inside that. So if you will just console.log the events, that what events will it get. So we have the onChange equals to the event. So this event has all of the properties, even the value of that input as well. So now if we now move on to the application, if we move on to the inspect, if we move on to the console, we can remove everything from there. So if we type anything inside that, like I will type a, and then you will see an event is being fired, and now you can see we have the synthetic base event and the name equals to the onChange, and then you can see all of the things inside that event. So now you can see now we have the invalid bubble, and then you have the type equals to the text of the inputs, and then you have so many things aligned with that. So now if we now move on to the state, and now you can see now we are logging the value of the input. And now what we can do is we can just have here the set name, and the set name function will get the event. So it will get the event dot target dot value property, which will have the value of that input. So we will have the onChange function, and then we have the set name property, and the value is equals to the event dot target dot value. So we are giving the value equals to the name, and then whenever any input is being pressed, so the onChange function will then call, and then it will grab the value of that input, and then it will update the value to the set name function, which is updating the value of that name variable. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, now I will refresh the page, and now you can see now you will be able to enter any value inside this name. So then you can see now the name is having the values, and now it is getting the values which are available inside the name as well. So if we create a paragraph tag after that, and it will create the, and it will have the value as the name. If we now save, so now you will see now whatever you will type here, it will be appearing here. So I will remove everything. I will type here the Nikhil. So now you will see whatever I am typing here, it is being rendered here, because now we have the value equals to the name. So this is how it works. And now we can just move on to the email as well. So we can just define the same thing for the email. So we have the onChange function for the email. So we have the onChange, and in the onChange you will have the event prop in the callback function, and then you will have the set email to the event dot target dot value. So same for the password as well. And then you can just paste the onChange function for the password as well. So you have the set password, and now you can get all of the values here as well, like you get the email, you get the paragraph again, or it get the password, and for the email as well you get the email. If we now save, so now you will see now you will get all of the things inside that. What you will do is you can enter anything, like for the email, like for the name you can enter the Nikhil, and then you can see the name is being rendered here, and then you can have an email, like you can have 12345@test.com, and then you can see the name is updating, and then you can see once you will just move on and type any password like 123456, so the password is also being rendered here. So now you can see now we are handling the state inside the React as well. So now you can see everything is working perfectly fine. And now if you want these values to be rendered inside this log window, so you can do one thing is you can just move on to the form, and then you can just define the onSubmit prop. So the onSubmit is called whenever we submit the form. So there also you can get the event, and then you can just have here the event.preventDefault. So the prevent default will prevent the default behavior of the form, like it sends the data and then it refreshes the page. So for that you can just have here the prevent default to stop that, and then after that you can just have here the function inside that, and after that you can just have here the values of the inputs as well. So you just log the values, you can just log the value of the name, you can just log the value of the email, and then you can just log the values of the password as well. So if we now save, if I will now move on to the application, I will now refresh this. If I will now just enter the value like Nikhil at the test.com, email is there, and the password is 123456. So if we now click on the submit, and now you can see now we got the values of the email and the name and the password as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now we have just handled the form inside the React with the useState. So now you can see we have handled the form with the useState inside the React. But if we now move on to the application, now you can see now what we are doing is we are declaring a state variable for every input field. But is that a good option? I think no, because if we have multiple input elements inside the application, like if we have something around 10 to 20 inputs and even like 50 inputs, then it would be difficult to declare the state variables for every input over there. But what we can do to make this more dynamic, so for that we can just create a single state variable, and it would be the inputs by default value, and the second variable would be the function, it will be the set inputs, and then it will be equals to a value, and it can be the useState. And this time the useState will contain an object. and not the simple string value. So it will contain the variables, like it can be the name, and the name is equals to the empty string, and then it will contain the email, and email will also be an empty string, and then it will contain the password, and password will also be an empty string. And now what we can do is, now we can just move on to the inputs, and now we can just define the value it equals to the inputs dot name, and then we can just move on to the email field, and then we can just define the value, and it can be the inputs dot email field. And after that we can just move on to the password. We can just define the value as the inputs dot password. And now we have just defined the state variables for every input, and then we have given the values to that input elements. And now what we can do is we can just create a onChange function here before the render, and there we will handle the state of every input element, and it will be a fully dynamic approach. So what we can do is we can just remove the event from there, and now we can just define the function as the handle change. It will be the function as the handle change. So then now we can just copy that, and then we can just paste that for every input variable here. So it can be the input onChange equals to the handle change, and then here as well onChange equals to the handle change. So it will be fully dynamic. And now we can just create the onChange function here as well. So we have a const, it will be the handle change, and it will contain the event as the parameter, because by default the React sends an event value if we point to a function, and here we are pointing to a function as the handle change. So it will grab the event which will be thrown here. So we will get the event of the onChange in the handle change as well. So now what we can do is we need to update the state. So as we know, for updating the state we need to call the set inputs. But what do we need to do? So now we need two things here. So we need the target.property name. So what we can do is we can just grab the event.target.property name. Like now we have here the property name equals to the name. So we can just grab the value as the event.target.name. And for the same event, so whenever any event will be thrown to this input, so we will just grab the event.target.name and then event.target.value for this input as well. So we get the event.target.value. So now what it will do is, once we will move on to this input, once we will enter any value inside this input, so it will just fire this event as the event.target.name. So we will get two values, event.target.name and their value. And then once it will move on to the email, so the event will be changed, and then the event will be on the email. So it can be the event.target.name equals to the email, and then for the email updation, so we will get the target.value for the email updation, and same for the password. So once it will move on to the password, so we will grab the property name of the password, and then we will update the value, because we have given the same values as the identifiers as well. So for the name we have given the name, for the email we have given the email, and for the password we have given the password. So this is how we can do all of the things. So now we can just remove the form and the onSubmit here, and after that now we can just define the handle change, and inside that we need to update the state. So for that we need to have here the set inputs, and in the set inputs what we can do is we can just update the state. So in the set inputs what we will do is we will just grab the target.property name, so it can be the event.target.name of every input, and then we will just set their values like event.target.value. If we now save, so now it should be in the objects. So because we are working with the objects, so, and I will now wrap this inside the objects. So we can just log the value of the inputs object that we have defined inside the state here, and the inputs have the name, email and the password. So if we now save, if we now refresh the page, so if I will enter anything here, like I will enter the name, and I will enter the email and the password like 1 2 3 4 5 6. But if I will now just submit the form, like now you can see only the password is being shown here. But why? Inside the set inputs, so the last input which was fired was the password, and it is just storing the value of the last input which was fired, and it is not grabbing the previous state that we have just generated for the name and the email. So we have to secure that also. So now what we need to do is we can just define and we can just modify this. So I will now remove this from there, and then we will start again from the scratch. So first we will grab the previous state of the inputs. So how we can grab the previous state? So we can just declare the callback variable inside the set inputs function. So it will just grab the previous state. So we can just have here the previous state, and after that we will just return something, and we will return the latest updated state with that. So with the latest updated state, we will just grab the previous state first. So here we are defining the previous state. So we will just have first the previous state, and after that we will have here the property and the value. So we will have the event.target.name, and then the event.target. So it can be the value. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, if I will now refresh the page, Like now you can say if I will enter anything inside the name like Nikhil, if we enter anything inside the email like test.com, and the password like 123456, we now submit, and now you can see now we got the values for every input, and because of that previous state. So if we remove the previous state, then it will just remove the previous state from the state, and it will just give you only the latest updated state snapshot. It is very helpful with that. So this is how we can handle the form inside the React with the useState. So now we have just created this dynamic function, and it will handle the state dynamically with every input field. And make sure you have given the same identifier values like name, email, and the password inside their target.name property as well. Like in the name, you have given the name. For the email, you have given the name equals to the email, and the password, we have given the name equals to the password. So this is how we can handle the form inside the React.js with the useState hook. So the next approach of handling the form will be with the useRef hook. So what is that hook? So it creates a reference to the input element directly to the DOM. But what does that mean? So it allows you to persist the values between the renders, and it is used to access the DOM elements directly. So you create a reference directly to the DOM variable, and it can be a body tag, it can be h1 tag, and it can be the input tag as well. And after that, it just links directly to the DOM, and then we can just get the all of the properties and their values of the DOM as well. And it can be used to store a mutable value that does not cause a re-render. So with the useState, whenever we write anything inside the input, like if we enter the name, so every time we enter any value inside the useState, the component is re-renders, but not in the useRef, because it creates a reference directly to the DOM, and it converts the controlled components to the uncontrolled components inside the React. So what is the controlled and the uncontrolled components? So the controlled components is being controlled by the React and not by the DOM. But with the uncontrolled components, we control the components manually through the DOM tree. So this is how the ref works. So it creates a reference to the node, and then we control the components manually with that, and it does not cause the re-renders as well. So now we will use this approach as well. So now we can just move on to the Visual Studio Code, and here we can remove everything from there because now we don't need them at all. So I will remove the inputs and the handle change function from there, and I will remove the console.log inputs from there as well. And now we don't need the useState, but now we need the useRef hook from the React. So we'll use the useRef, and after that now we need to declare the useRef hook. So the useRef hook declares a single variable, and it can be the reference variable. And with the useRef, we need to separately define the refs for every input element. So for that, we can just define the input ref. So we can just define the const, it would be the name ref, and it will be equals to the useRef. And after that, we can just define the const as the email ref, and it will be equals to the useRef. And then we can just define the value of the const, and it can be equals to the password ref, and it will be equals to the useRef again. So now what we are doing here, so the useRef is just linking these variables directly to the DOM, and then we can just get their IDs, we can just get anything from that variable as well. So now what we can do is we can just move on to the input, and now we don't need the onChange function with that. And now the value, we don't need the value as well. But what it does, so we need to give here the reference. So we have the ref prop with that. So we need to define the ref, and the ref would be the ref that we have just created. Like we have just created the name ref for the name. So we need to give here the name ref. After that, we can just move on again to the input here. And in the input, now we need to remove this value and the onChange. So we need to give here only the ref. The ref would be equals to the email ref that we have just created. And same for the password, we can just move on to the input for the password, and then we give the ref as the password ref that we have created. So if we now save, so now we need to get the values as well. But how can we get the values? So I will now just modify this onSubmit function as well, and I will now just create another function with the onSubmit because it is not looking good. We can just create the function for the onSubmit first. So we have the handle submit, and it contains an event prop. After that, it will just be event default with that, and after that we need to remove this onSubmit from function from here, and I will now just directly call here the handle submit. So everything is working perfectly fine. So whenever we are submitting the form, now we need to get the values of all of the input variables which are directly linked to the DOM. So how can we do that? So we can just get their values, like it can be the const, it can be the email, and it will be equals to the email ref dot current. So we have the current property with that, and we can get the value as well from the current property. So now we can just get here the values for the name. So we can get the const name would be equals to the name ref, dot current dot value, and after that we can just get here the password as well. So we can get the password const to the password, and it will be equals to the password ref dot current dot value. So if we now save, and if I will now just log these values as well, so we get the email, we get the name, and then we get the password. If we now save, if we now move on to the application, if I will now refresh the page, and then you will see now once I will enter anything to the name, like I will enter Nikhil, we have the email and the password. So once I will just submit the form, and then you will see now we got all of these values there. So we got the email, we got the name, and then we also got the password as well. But what is that current from here? So if we just move on, and if we just log the values of that current property, like you can just get the email ref dot current. So if we now just log the current property here, if I will now submit the form, and now you can see the current element which is now accessed with this reference property is the input type equals to the email. So this is how it works. So if we just move on, if we just remove the current property, if we just log the email ref, then you will see there will be an object of all of the properties. Like you can say you have the current object, and in the current object you got the input, and after that in the input now you have all of the values which are now available inside the input directly into the DOM. So this is how the useRef works. So we get the current property in the useRef, then it contains all of the values and all of the properties with that. So this is how the useRef hook works. So it just creates a reference to the DOM variable, and then you can just get the values from the current and their values as well. And it is different from the useState, because if you want to update the data and cause a UI update inside the React, so you can use the useState because it is very helpful with that. But if you need some kind of data container like throughout the component lifecycle, you just don't need to re-render the component at all. So you can use the useRef with that because it does not re-render the components. So this is how we can handle the forms with the useRef hook inside the React. So the next approach would be with the useReducer hook. But what is that hook? So it is used for the complex state management logic to boost the performance in our application, and it acts as an alternative hook to the useState hook to manage the complex state in your application. And the useReducer hook uses the same concept as the Redux. So if you know about the Redux, then it would be very similar to you, but if you don't know about the Redux, then it would be very simple to you inside this video. So now let's use the useReducer hook. So it exactly returns the two values, the state and the dispatch. The state, which we can use as a state, and then we have a dispatch function to update the state. But what is the link between them? So the link between them comes whenever we pass some values to the useReducer hook. So in the useReducer, the first parameter which we need to pass is the reducer function. But what is the reducer function? So in the reducer function, we handle the logic of the state. So in the reducer function, we return the newly updated state to the state variable inside that, and then it just updates the state. And the dispatch function is used to dispatch an action, is used to send an action to the reducer function, and then it will generate the action. It will just create the logic to update the state within that action. So now let's see how we can use the useReducer hook, but it's very complex, but I will not just make it very easy for you. So let's dive into the application. And here you can see now I'm into the application, and now I have removed every state logic from there. And then we have just a onSubmit function inside the form, and then we have the prevent default inside that. And now we will use the useReducer hook. So as we have discussed, the useReducer returns exactly two values inside the array. So we can just use the useReducer hook. So it can be useReducer, and the first parameter which it contains, which is the reducer function. So we will just pass here the reducer just for now, and then we will create the reducer function after that. And after that we need to pass here the initial state. So for that we can just declare the initial state as well, but we can just have here the initial state as well. So we can have an initial state, and now we need to declare these two variables as well, but I will do that later. And now inside the useReducer, it returns two values. First, it returns a state object that links to the initial state first, and then it will just update this state. And after that it returns the dispatch function to dispatch an action. So we use the state and the dispatch with the useReducer hook. And now we need to just define the reducer function and the initial state. So now we can just create the reducer function before the component as well, because it will cause the component to re-render every time. So we will use here the useReducer and the initial state before the component renders. So we can have a const, it will be the initial state, and it will be an object. It will contain the name property as we have done with the useState as well. So the name, email, and the password. So all three have the empty values, and after that we can just generate the reducer function. So we can have a const reducer, and it will be equals to a function, and it will get some parameters. So it will get the parameters. The first parameter it will get will be the state. So it get the current state object, and after that it gets the second value as the action. So it get the state and the action. But how it is linked? So we get the state. So this state object is being sent to the state, and then we need to send here the dispatch. So dispatch is a function which will be called whenever we will send any data to the reducer function. So the action contains the data and the type of that data that we need to define. So it contains two properties inside that. It is the type and the payload. The type, we need to define a unique type for every field. Like here we are using the name, email and the password. So we need to just generate the unique type, and after that we need to just handle the state with the values as well. So we send the type and the values with the dispatch function. But how does all that work? So we can just save for now, and then we can just move on to the inputs, and then we can just give their values. So we can have here the value again, and the value can be equals to the state object that we have defined inside that dot name field, because we have defined the state, and the state is linked to the initial state as well. So it will get the name property as well. So we have the state dot name. So now we will copy that value again for the email. So we have the value equals to the state dot email, and then we can just copy that. Then we can just move on to the password. We can just give the value of the state dot password. And after that what we can do is we can just dispatch an action on every event which is pressed. So like now you can see, once I will now just add the onChange function, and inside that onChange function I will now just add here the callback function here only. So it will get the event first, and after that what we can do is we can just dispatch an event or dispatch an action to the reducer function. So it generates the data and then it sends the data to the reducer function. So we dispatch an action. So here we can dispatch an action. So dispatch, we need to send here the dispatch an action, and the action contains two objects as we have discussed, the type and the payload. And the type we can just give any specific unique type, like it can be the name, and after that we can just give the payload value here. So we can have the payload, and the payload value we can give any value, like here we can give the actual value with the event.target.value. So now what we are doing here is we have just defined the onChange function, and then we are dispatching the values, the type and the payload. The type contains a unique type for every field, and the payload contains like the data for every field. And we can just do same for every other input as well. So we can just move on to the input for the email, and then we can just grab the onChange function for the email, and with the email we will have the specific different type. Like here we have the name, it will have the email, and after that we can just use the password. So we can just move on to the input password. So we can have onChange function here as well. So now you can see, now we are having the onChange, and this will be the password. So now what it will do here, so it will just dispatch an action, but now we need to add the logic to handle the state. So now we are getting the action, and then we are getting the type and the payload property here. So we are getting the type, and then we are getting the payload as well in the action object. So what we can do is we can just define here the action, and after that we need to just here define the switch cases here. So we can just have a switch case because we have the different actions, and we can also use the if else statements as well, but the switch case is more preferable and more effective. So we can use the switch case. So in the switch case here we will just get the type property from the action. So we get the action dot type. So in the action dot type, now we will just define some cases, like we have the case of the name. So in the name case what we can do is we can just return the newly updated state. But how can we return that? So we need to return the newly updated state, and the newly updated state will get the previous state as well. So we need to return the previous state with the newly updated state snapshot. But how can we do that? So we can just return here again an object, and first it will contain the previous state here, and after that we need to just update the state of the current action property. Like we have the name, so we can just have here the name property, and the name will be equals to the current property. Like here we will get the value of that name property from the action dot payload that we are sending. So what we are doing here is we are just giving here the case as the name, and then we are sending the return statement, and the return statement contains first the previous state because we don't need to lose the previous state, and after that we are sending the name with the action dot payload property with that, and then we can just copy that name for the email as well. Now we have the case as the email. So now the case is email, and now we need to send the email data with that, and after that we can just copy that. Then we can just copy for the password as well. So we can have a password, and in the password we need to just get here the password, because now we have defined the name, email and the password inside the initial state. And now we should have there the default case as well, because if we don't need to send an event, so we should have here the default case as well. So after that we have the default, and the default, what we can do, we can just return the previous state only. So we can just return the previous state. So if we now save, if I will now move on to the application, and now in the on submit we can just grab the values of the state as well. So we can just log the value of this state that we have just defined here. If we now save, if we now move on to the application, I will refresh the page. So now if we enter any data, like I will enter the Nikhil inside this name, and the email is same and the password is same. So if we now just click on the submit, now you can see now we get all of the values, and now you can see now we are getting all of the values that we have defined. So we have just defined the name as the Nikhil, we have defined the email as the nikhil@test.com, we have the password as well. So now the useReducer hook is working perfectly fine, as we are just defining all of the values there, and then we are defining here the state as well with the rest parameters. So if we now just remove this state from there, if we now move on to the application, if we now just define here some state, like it can be the Nikhil. So now you will see now you got an error also. So if I will now submit the form, now you can see now we only got the name as the Nikhil, because we only updated the Nikhil. So this is how we can handle this form inside the ReactJS with the useReducer hook, and this is very helpful if you want a complex state management logic, because it is same like the Redux. So we have the state variables, and then we dispatch and actions, and then we return the newly updated state with the Redux as well. So this is very helpful with that. So now we have seen 3 approaches to handle the form inside the ReactJS. So now we have seen how to handle the form with the 3 approaches. So now let's see the summary of how we did that. So we have used the useState hook to handle the forms first, and then we have created the dynamic function to handle the state of the form with the dynamic approaches, and then we have used the useRef hook to create the reference to the DOM inside the ReactJS, and then we have used the useRef to update the form, and then we have also used the useReducer hook, in which we just declared the form, and then we have declared the reducer function to update the form. So this is all about this video. So thank you for watching the video, and I hope you will like the video as well. So please subscribe to the channel as well, so I would be motivated to post the videos like this. So thank you so much.